Welcome to the Original Self Podcast. I'm Yvette Dakota, owner of Dakota Life Coaching and a psychology-informed life coach, exploring resilience, mindset, and the courage to become your authentic self. This is a space for honest conversations about growth, identity, relationships, and all the messy moments in between that shape who we become. Between the salon chair and coaching sessions, I've watched people move through life in patterns they rarely notice. Patterns that are subtle, familiar, and incredibly hard to see from the inside. Last time, in episode 20, we talked about what your body is doing during menopause. The shifting hormones, the changing hunger signals, the cravings that seem to arrive right on schedule every evening. We close with a question worth sitting with. What if the story isn't about what's wrong with your body, but about what your body is renegotiating? Today, we carry that same question to a place that's a bit harder to reach. We've spent 5 episodes looking at the system around us and the body underneath us. Now we turn toward the self and toward the words we've been using about what we eat. Welcome to episode 21, Food Addiction, Food Shame, and the Cheat Day Lie. So let's start with a question many of you have probably asked yourself at some point, usually somewhere between the 3rd and 4th slice. Am I addicted to food? I don't think that's a small question. And for a long time, the scientific community didn't agree on how to answer it. But that's starting to change. Sometime in late 2025, an international group of researchers and clinicians who study this area completed something called the Delphi process, which is basically a structured way of getting experts to work toward an agreement on a contested question. They all proposed the name ultra-processed food use disorder and concluded that this pattern behaves primarily like a substance use disorder rather than just a behavioral habit as they've thought for years. One researcher suggested that this disorder should be included in future editions of the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual. The tool that most often was used in this study to figure out if it's a disorder is called the Yale Food Addiction Scale. It takes 11 of the criteria used to diagnose substance use disorders, things like loss of control, cravings, withdrawal, and continuing to use something despite real consequences. They applied all of those to the same criteria to eating. Using this measure, researchers estimated that around 14% of adults meet the criteria that would qualify as a substance use disorder if we were talking about alcohol instead of food. Not all of the researchers agreed. They stated that they needed more evidence before formalizing a diagnosis. Other questions concern whether what we're measuring is truly addiction or whether it's a predictable response to an environment engineered for overconsumption, which is what we talked about in episodes 16 and 17. From that perspective, the issue isn't addiction in the traditional sense. It's a rational response to an irrational food supply. But one area that's getting more attention is withdrawal. That's traditionally been considered a core marker of addiction. And some early studies report withdrawal-like symptoms when people significantly reduce highly processed foods. They have symptoms of irritability, fatigue, and mood changes. within the first day of reducing those foods. That evidence is still developing, and researchers are careful not to overstate it, but it's part of why the substance use conversation has gained traction rather than just disappearing and no one talking about it anymore. This is how I think about it. Food isn't alcohol, and it's not cigarettes. I've said this before. You can quit drinking and you can quit smoking, but you can't quit eating. For every model of addiction that researchers have built, it assumes recovery involves some version of abstinence, putting the substance down for good. Food doesn't allow for that, though. You have to sit back down at the table tomorrow and the day after that for the rest of your life. The single fact is what makes this question so complicated. Is food addiction real? I have said before that I quit smoking after smoking a pack or more per day for 13 years. I've never looked back. It was very hard to quit, and I always say I will never smoke again because I'm never quitting again. With that said, the sugar and hyperpalatable food pull is a constant for me for my entire life. I barely drink alcohol, I don't smoke, and I try to eat foods that are nourishing to my body, but I'm always thinking about sugar. I've gone to nutritionists thinking that, yet another plan mapped out for me will solve my problem. I've seen a food therapist in hopes that something deep inside me needs nourishing and that would solve my cravings. I've gone to food retreats where I have meditated and participated in exercises that try to make me realize that it's not hunger, it's the soul crying out for more. None of that worked. Maybe it worked for others, it didn't work for me. This is what fascinates me. Some of the strongest, most resilient people I know have rebuilt entire lives after unimaginable loss, but they still describe feeling powerless around certain foods. We know by now that it's not a lack of discipline, right? It's trying to rebuild a relationship with something we have to interact with all the time. That's a completely different challenge, and it's why the research matters beyond the label. Researchers are now developing screening tools clinicians can use in ordinary medical visits, the kind of questionnaire a doctor might hand you alongside the usual intake forms. In this research, early findings suggest a meaningful overlap between this pattern and conditions like type 2 diabetes, where the two may make each other harder to manage. So this is not an abstract academic argument. It's shaping how treatment gets built even before diagnostic manuals catch up. But whatever label eventually sticks, a diagnosis is not a life sentence. It's a way to understand and then move forward with the information you have. When we recognize ourselves in these patterns, that's information. It's information about the mechanisms. It has nothing to do with your worth. The name we give that experience may continue to evolve. Researchers may keep debating whether addiction is the right framework, whether another explanation fits better, or where this belongs in the future of treatment. But while the scientists work through that language, millions of people are living with the experience. And whatever we eventually call it, turning that experience into a judgment about ourselves creates shame and helps no one. The purpose of understanding the mechanism was never to assign ourselves another label to carry. It was to finally have enough information to actually put one down. So there's a pattern so many of us know intimately, even if we don't have a name for it. Many people experience this as a personal struggle they can't quite understand. But the research shows that it follows a predictable cycle. It's called the binge-restrict cycle, and it moves through 4 stages. The first stage is restriction. It may look like skipping meals, cutting out entire food groups, counting every calorie, or building a long list of rules about what you're allowed to eat and when. From the outside, and often from the inside, this phase feels like discipline. It feels like it's working. That's part of what makes this cycle so difficult to recognize. Restriction usually doesn't feel like the beginning of a problem, right? It feels like the moment you finally decided to solve one. It comes with a sense of control, a plan, and that familiar thought, this is the thing that's finally going to work. I can say honestly, I have tried every one of those restrictions I just mentioned countless times throughout my life. The second stage is craving. Restriction can send messages to your brain and to your body that something important is unavailable. Your body responds to scarcity by turning up the volume on hunger and repeatedly pulling your attention toward that restricted food. But craving is different from hunger because hunger is the body asking for energy. Craving is targeted and specific. It's the food that you decided was off limits, but suddenly seems to be everywhere. You notice it more, you think about it more, and then you start negotiating with yourself around this food. Maybe I'll just have one. Maybe I'll wait until the weekend. Maybe I'll just leave the house so I don't think about it anymore. The more attention the brain gives something, the more important it starts to feel. The food didn't change. Your relationship with the food has. This is an ancient survival system responding the way it was completely designed to respond. For most of human history, directing attention to something scarce helped keep us alive. The problem is that today, that same system is responding in an environment where restriction and abundance can coexist at the same time. The third stage is the actual binge. This is the point where the tension that's been building finally breaks. It often looks like eating past fullness, eating very quickly, or eating the very foods that were restricted in the first place. For many people, this stage feels super confusing because it doesn't always feel like a conscious decision. Sometimes it can feel like something switches from thinking about the food to needing the food. The same food that was avoided for days or weeks, months, suddenly becomes the thing your brain is pushing you towards. And once that rule is broken, another thought enters the conversation. Well, I already messed up today. Might as well keep going. That one thought alone can turn a moment of eating into something much bigger. The fourth stage, the final stage, is guilt. You see, the problem with guilt is that it doesn't usually end the cycle. It often becomes the reason for the next round of restriction, reinforcing the very pattern you were trying to escape. There's also a physical layer beyond the psychological pull. Research suggests that long-standing binge-restrict patterns can affect things like hunger hormone regulation and insulin sensitivity. That cycle can leave a physiological imprint, like where the body adapts to an unpredictable food supply in the same way it would if scarcity of all food were real instead of self-imposed. This cycle doesn't just stay connected to the appetite. Restriction and the anxiety it produces can disrupt your sleep, whether that's being too hungry to settle at night or from the physical discomfort that follows a binge. Poor sleep then feeds back into the whole system, since we already know from episode 18 that a tired prefrontal cortex is a weaker brake, like brakes in a car. Mood follows a similar pattern. Research on this cycle consistently links it with higher rates of anxiety and low moods, depressed feeling. They're not a completely separate issue running alongside eating, but it's like it's part of the interconnected system. And nutrition itself plays a role in the brain's emotional centers. So when intake becomes uncertain, mood often becomes unpredictable right along with it. The pull toward the very thing you try to avoid is something researchers have studied. It's sometimes called the forbidden fruit effect, and it describes how foods can become more appealing and take up more mental space simply because they've been restricted, independent of how the food actually tastes. That restriction changes the food relationship. I'm sure that many of our experiences involve putting a food on the nope, I can't eat that food list. And then your brain begins to find every reason to think about it. Or even better, every commercial or cooking show you watch shows that specific food that you actually sent into the no-fly zone. Right now, picture the food, or an entire group of food, that makes this scenario sound familiar to you. For me, in this scenario, I'll decide Monday morning that carbs like pasta are officially off the table for the week, or completely off the table forever. And I'm sure that'll totally work out for me. But by Wednesday evening, I've thought about the Orchietta Il Davide plate from my favorite restaurant around the corner more times than you can count, despite not having thought about it once the week before, when it was allowed in my mind. That's the forbidden fruit effect. It shows up in everyday life. I once read an article by the author Geneen Roth, and it was called Kindness in Calories. She told the story of a mother whose daughter always snuck sweets and was rapidly gaining weight. The mother was super concerned because she had been an overweight child herself, and she wanted to prevent the same fate for her daughter. So the mom took sweets away from her child and kind of admonished her for her body shape, for gaining weight. Roth suggested something that I'm sure felt very counterintuitive to the mother. She told her to fill a pillowcase with M&Ms, and whenever it got even a quarter empty, fill it back up again. She also suggested to the mother to stop making ill remarks about her daughter's body. At first, this young girl carried the pillowcase everywhere. But then slowly, something changed. When the candy stopped being scarce, it stopped holding the same power over the child. If you've lived this cycle, and my guess is many of you have, I just want to say diet culture markets restriction as the solution to exactly the problem restriction helps create. The advice is almost always to restrict harder, follow more rules, and eliminate more categories. I have seen this my entire life. And because restriction can produce short-term results, maybe even weight loss in the first few weeks, a sense of control in that moment looks like it's working, right? Right up until the body response catches up with it. I think most people never connect their own binge back to the restriction that it came before it. I know I didn't. We just experienced the binge as more evidence for the belief that we can't be trusted around food. And then we reach for more restriction to correct it. That's the loop closing in on itself. Can we start to question the rules we were handed and the ones we eventually place on ourselves? Because maybe the way out of the cycle, it's not another rule. Maybe it starts with understanding why the rules had so much power over us in the first place. So if the binge restrict cycle is the mechanism, then the cheat day is the mechanism with a calendar attached to it. Plan the restriction for 6 days. Plan the loss of restraint for the 7th. Call it a balance. Words like cheat, clean, good, and bad, they don't just describe food. Over time, and I've heard it a million times, they start describing how we see ourselves. A cheat day implies that eating a food you enjoy is something you get away with. Something that requires an exception to be granted. Many dietitians and eating disorder clinicians point out that moralizing food can increase guilt, shame, and how much mental space the food takes up in your brain. This is the opposite of what anyone wants from a system that's supposed to make eating easier. But notice what this language does to the rest of our week. If Saturday's the cheat day, when we're allowed to enjoy food, then Monday through Friday becomes the day you're supposed to earn it. That's a lot of days spent turning an ordinary food choice into something loaded with rules. The negotiating, the meaning. And as we just learned, restriction sets up the next binge. The cheat day doesn't always prove to be the release valve it's marketed as. I think it becomes another version of the same cycle, except this time the rules are organized around the calendar. I've done this for decades. I can remember ending a day and mentally reviewing everything I ate. If it were on paper, I would have needed a red pen to mark every lapse in judgment that I thought I had made. Red marks if I didn't stay on track, if I messed up and forgot to count the wintergreen mint I shoved in my mouth after drinking coffee. I would assess whether today's food intake made for a good day or a bad day. It was so exhausting. It took me a long time to notice that the scorecard itself, not the dessert, was a thing that was causing the stress, the judgment, and ultimately the damage to me. There's another side to this conversation. Some researchers have found that including enjoyable foods intentionally can help people feel more satisfied and maintain a way of eating that works for them in the long term. I don't think that finding cancels out everything we just covered. I think it points to something more specific. The difference isn't whether you plan the food. It's the meaning attached to it. A cheat day is planned, but there's a big difference between deciding you'd like pasta on Friday because you enjoy pasta and declaring Friday the only day you're allowed to have the pasta because every other day it represents failure. It's the moral language wrapped around allowed and not allowed. When I look at cultures where food is approached with more flexibility, I think it offers a different way to think about our relationship with eating. Pasta isn't saved for Saturday. Dessert's not treated like contraband. In these cultures, food is woven through life rather than rationed out on a schedule. And cravings tend to soften, not disappear entirely, once a food stops being treated as a rare treat you have to earn. Letting go of the moral scorecard entirely reduces the weight of forbidden foods, which means that there's less for the binge-restrict cycle to hold on to. It means the structure stops being built around morality and starts being built on what actually helps you feel good in your mind and body. Concept. So let's bring these three threads together. The biologically driven addiction process is still being studied. The way the body responds to scarcity, whether that scarcity comes from the outside world or from rules we've created ourselves. And then there's the moral weight we assign to foods that eventually gets turned inward. Not one of those three issues changes by adding another layer of judgment. That's the piece I really want us to focus on. The shift happens when we trade our shame for curiosity. When we stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking different questions. Like, what patterns keep repeating? What rules did I inherit that I never stopped to question? And then maybe we finally reach that discovery moment of, no wonder it's all felt so confusing. Because understanding the pieces is what calms the chaos. What's easy to miss is, in all of this, that curiosity isn't the same as permissiveness. And it's not the same as giving up on caring for yourself. It just means we stop using shame as a strategy. Asking what's happening here is still an act of care. Sometimes often more a reflective one, because it gives you something you can actually work with. Where blame keeps you stuck repeating the same conversations with yourself. Curiosity helps you understand the conversation you've been trying to have for years, for decades. That understanding is where we can finally start asking the next question. What is the behavior trying to do for us? There was a version of you long before you learned which foods were supposed to be good or bad, and who had a different relationship with eating. No scorecard, no cheat days, no chapters of rules to memorize. That version of you has not disappeared. It just got layered over the same way we talked about it in every episode of this series. Layered over by systems, by biology trying to protect you. And now, by a vocabulary that turned eating into a moral report card. If there's one thing I hope you carry away from this episode, it's permission to retire a few words. Cheat, clean, good, bad. They're never accurate food descriptions to begin with, nor were they accurate descriptions of you. Changing the way we talk about food is also an opportunity to change the way we talk about ourselves, because they are completely interconnected. In the next and final episode of this series, we're going to talk about what happens after we understand the rules. How do we tell the difference between a body asking for food and an emotion asking for comfort? How do we rebuild trust with ourselves after years of second guessing? Episode 22 is Coming Home, Learning to Trust Yourself Again. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If you'd like to learn more about working with me, all my contact information is in the episode notes. I'll see you next time, and I hope you have a great day.